we're excited to be back on the show today talking about some of the pitfalls in pricing, and particularly a really common mistake people make in pricing is pricing off of what the market conditions are or what they think people would pay them for a service as opposed to what things cost.
Yeah.
And there's hidden costs. There's the cost of doing business that sometimes gets missed. And I think there's an essential aspect of using cost as the basis for pricing.
Yeah.
And we're going to talk today about some practical ways of doing that and just dive right into this topic because I think it's really, really important. When I was starting my business, I think I thought like a consumer and thought like, well, all the things that really stood out to me when I was usually hiring other people to do work were quality, speed, price, and you'd start thinking like a consumer as opposed to like a contractor, like running a business.
Yeah.
And you're thinking, well, yeah, I can do that. Amazing quality. It'll be competitive pricing. It'll be, I'll be delivering on all of those categories instead of realizing what it'll cost you to do that.
Yeah.
And we get very naive and sort of put the cart before the horse.
Yeah. I think a big piece of it is we have a lot of conversations with contractors who are, at different phases in their construction business too. And man, it's just this concept is something that we try to just preach early on, I guess. Preach is maybe not the right word, but to convey early on of like, man, if you're in your first day of owning your construction business or you're in your 30th year, I think this is something to just come back to and make sure that you still know it because costs change, your value changes. I mean, we talk about this. We've talked about value on the last few podcasts too, and I think they're worth listening to as well. But I think that this is a big piece no matter where you're at in your journey of owning your own business. So kind of take me back to, your own construction company. Like what were some of the dangers of us underestimating costs? Like what are, do you have some projects where you're like, oh man, we just totally bid it wrong and lost our shirt on a job. And I'm sure everybody has some of those scenarios and examples. And then like, how did you come to the point where you're like, oh, I need to nail this down?
I don't know that cost-based pricing is necessarily what's even taught. I think a lot of times you are looking at market conditions. You're looking at, well, what's the going rate for a particular service? And I essentially arrived at this methodology of be like, cost is the foundation for what you should charge people, kind of the hard way. I think you can stay home and essentially lose no money. Like you're not going to lose any money sitting around doing nothing.
Right.
But if you go work for somebody and underbid a job, that's extraordinarily painful. And I think, to do a job at a loss, who wants to do that? And I think understanding costs, it's very difficult to understand costs. And I think that's the reason why it sometimes gets missed is because there must be an easier way.
Yeah. I think what you're saying though too, I'm like, what I hear is like, but what if you don't know you're losing money on the job, right? Like if you don't know your cost, then it's very hard to know if you're losing money at all.
Yeah.
Right. And
it's a great point. And I think the other piece of it that back to your question of like some of the stories, I think one of the other things that really stood out to me is that costs really sort of snuck up on me on the cost of running a business because when you start off, you really have nothing going for you as far as, nothing going for you on a lot of categories. But you might have some talent, some skill and things you can sell. Sure. But from a standpoint of tools and branding and trucks, you just don't have overhead
it's
yet.
Just early.
It's so easy to just say, well, I'm going to go charge $50 an hour. Seems fair enough to me. You go find a customer who's happy to pay you that. And then as you start buying tools even, that's a significant investment in your business. And that if you factored, well, those tools they don't last forever either. You're going to be replacing tools. You're going to be replacing vehicles. You're going to be replacing trailers or whatever other things you need in order to run a business. And so that is what everyone else in the market is having to do.
Sure.
Maintain a business and charge for things that they're going to have to replace. And so you're starting a business a lot of times naively into the sense of, well, I can clean up here because I don't have that overhead.
Yeah.
But at some point you need it.
Yeah.
And I think that was the thing that really snuck up on me was as the business scaled, that overhead started to become a factor. And it wasn't always something I kept in mind. Yeah. The other piece about it is it's very time consuming to figure out what things cost you. And a lot of times we don't even understand how to do that.
Right.
And I think having a methodology, having a framework for doing that is something we should touch on today.
That's good. You talked a little bit about tools, trucks, things like that. What are some of the categories of costs, right? Because there's a few different categories. It's not just, the price of material, the price of labor, those kinds of things. But what are the categories? Educate me on that.
Yeah, and I think that's a great call out because there are direct costs. That is the materials you need to do a job, the labor involved in doing it. And then there's the indirect costs, which is the trucks, the tools, the insurance, office staff if you have that, if you scale to that point where you need office staff, the process of selling jobs. Most people don't charge for doing that or can't. They're in a business. If you're a plumber, a lot of times nobody's going to pay you to give them an estimate.
Right.
They expect it for free.
Yeah.
But that costs you money to do that. So that's an indirect cost. So I think there's a lot of things going on there that sometimes get missed.
Yeah, on overhead too.
Yeah.
Right. Overhead
And
costs.
so, and I think we can factor a lot of the indirect costs into overhead.
Okay.
I like to just kind of keep that simple in that category.
Sure.
Just like, okay, overhead covers anything that's not directly related to performing a job.
Mm-hmm.
The other piece that's so easy to miss is we assume we're going to be 100% efficient. We're going to get things done fast. And that's not always the case. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to have delays. We're going to have problems.
Yeah.
I saw an Instagram video of a high-end home builder where he was showing this it's probably a $20 million home that he had built, maybe more.
Yeah.
And what they had in this entertainment room, this theater, just unbelievable. Probably cost several $100,000 just for this one room.
Yep.
And they had made a mistake on where the furniture would fit in with the stair. And he's like, this is part of a high-end home building where no matter how careful you are with all of the furnishings and fixtures and everything else, somebody's going to make a mistake and you're going to have to correct it.
Yeah. And in that context, you're even working off plans.
Yes.
Not everything
is laid out ahead of time. It's still a mistake happening.
Yeah. It's so true.
Yeah. So it's so easy, I think, to assume we're going to be perfect instead of factoring the fact that we're not.
Yeah.
That was a huge mistake for me. And a lot of times I also had to shift from if I made a mistake, I owned it and fixed it. When you're running a business and hiring people, that's not the way it works. You pay someone to go fix the mistake. Yeah. You pay them to make the mistake and you pay them to go fix it.
Yeah, no, that's so true.
They show up to work and you pay them for their hours. Whatever gets done, gets done.
Whatever doesn't get done, never gets done.
So let's talk about another aspect of this would be some of the indirect. Well, it's a direct cost that sometimes gets missed, but it's distance of travel sometimes is a big factor as well. Yeah. Where we can think, well, if it's 5 miles away, well, it's so easy to get there, and then you have an hour away job. It was something that we had to adjust. We had a job in Clever, Missouri, which is about like a 45-minute drive from the shop, and that was significant. Every day, teams showing up at the shop, loading up, going there, having to drag tools over to a job that's in the middle of nowhere.
Well, and a shorter work day too.
Shorter work day,
yeah, because
somebody's paying for that.
Yeah, that's right.
It's either your employees paying for it or you are, and it's tough to keep people motivated when they're having to pay for the travel time.
Yeah. So is that travel time, is that part of the project overhead, or is it part of just like the bid? Like you're bidding for, it's a cost, obviously, for that specific project. So is it a line item, I guess, on the bid?
I think what we try to educate people on, or like as a methodology for doing that, would be use those as more or less adjustments to the hard costs of doing something. So having more or less these variables of being, well, for instance, if we're up on a 3-story home, we're going to need scaffolding. Well, we're still doing the same work, but the hard costs involved in doing it is going to be more significant because we need scaffolding. So it is a cost from my perspective. For sure. It's not overhead. And so I think that's the other piece that sometimes gets missed when we use these general numbers. Well, it costs us about that to do this, and it's supposed to be, well, for this specific job with these specific conditions in the middle of winter, it's going to be slower, it's further away. And
I think that's a good call out, even for like, I'm just thinking like a painter, right? Maybe you're a painter who's painted for 30 years and you're like, I know my square foot cost. You just know it. But what happens when you need scaffolding built? What happens when you need, you know what I mean? They have to go up and down the ladder every single time, things like that. So I think that's a really good call out of just like the complexity, making sure that that's added to the cost specifically.
So I think what we're trying to convey here is the cost is the foundational piece of what you charge people. And I think it's not standalone. We don't want to just drop it off there being like, well, let's add something on top of that and that will be the cost. I think market conditions are important to factor. For sure. But if you don't understand what things cost you, I have a good friend who was telling me that during COVID that they were really, really struggling because costs got away from them. And he's highly experienced. He knows what he's doing. He knows how to run a business. At the same time, he's saying, man, we almost went out of business because we didn't know what things cost us. Right. So we're not just talking to newbies here. I think this is something as a lesson for all of us. Cost is the foundation for price. And if you don't understand what things cost you, you can be in a world of hurt very fast.
Yeah. It's a good call out. So, okay, break down overhead a little bit. We've talked about overhead on a lot of episodes in the past. We we think it's super important for everyone to know their overhead.
And we've
But
got some comments like,
break it down, bro. I think
Yeah,
that was
it's so exciting to talk about overhead. Yeah, it's not. It's,
Wah, wah,
yeah,
wah.
yeah.
Is it easy to forget, or is it just hard to understand? Like
Yes.
how much it costs? Not
I
the
think,
other way around.
yeah, I think a bit of both. I think it's a good point. One thing is it's optimism. Sometimes we think like, how efficiently can we run a business? And that's part of it. But the hard to understand piece is it's so fluid. Like, give an example of this. Let's say, for instance, and I'd like to make this as understandable as possible.
Yeah.
Because I think it's critical.
Yeah.
Let's say, for instance, the production output of our company, we're in business, we're building things. Our production output is we can perform $30,000 of work in a given month.
Yeah.
So $30,000 of value can get charged to our customers in that period of time. Well, we're going to have this, let's say, $10,000 of overhead during that month's period of time.
Right.
The $30,000 is split over 2 jobs, let's just say, and $15,000 each job, just to try to get to some round numbers here, okay? So $10,000 of our costs went to overhead. We billed out $30,000. Well, then there's this other $20,000 category, which is for our labor, materials, and whatever's left over is profit.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's say, for instance, in the next month, we still have this $10,000 of overhead.
Yeah. But
we're at the tail end of that job that we started the previous month, and we didn't bill out $30,000 of services and value. We were nearing the end, and we had a long punch list, and we only billed out $20,000. Well, we have this $20,000 that we billed out. 50% of that was overhead. Mm-hmm. So it's an extremely high number, and so it's so fluid, so flexible, and it's so directly related to how efficient we are as a company. And I think that's the piece that becomes complex, is because so many times we'll run across a situation where we'll have to redo something. Well, the cost of that is doing it wrong, redoing it, and the overhead is still there, still accumulating over that period of time. Yeah. And also, we can make the mistake of scaling too fast. We can make the mistake of buying that truck before we have the actual production output to cover that cost and overhead. And so, I mean, I've made these mistakes, where you're like, wow, great, we're off to the races. We made $50,000 last month, so let's go buy the things we need. And you realize that overhead rate's creeping too much. Yeah. And I think that's the piece that sometimes gets missed. It's not just a simple formula and just understanding it even. It's also keeping it manageable. Yeah. And recognizing, well, sometimes we shouldn't be buying things before we actually have the production output to substantiate it. And guys, if you understand what things cost you from a standpoint of running your business, you're going to make smarter decisions, and you're going to be able to price appropriately. And this is where market conditions sort of play into it. Because if overhead is 50% of what you are able to bill out, well, it's very hard to be competitive. For sure. As opposed to keeping it more manageable, which is usually like a 20 to 30% ratio, which is, I mean, and there's people operating way less than that. Don't get me wrong. I mean, there's guys that are lightweight, right out of the back of the truck, and you don't have an office and staff and all the rest of it. So good. You talked about a lot of hidden costs with some of the things you talked about, travel time being one of them. What are some other hidden costs to just flag to make sure that they're not getting ignored? This is so crucial, because the delays in starting projects are costs as well that are hidden sometimes. Let's just say we need to acquire multiple permits to start a project. Well, we can't bill value yet for this job in the sense of covering the overhead and covering even, basically we just don't have those services being built against the job yet until we're able to start work. Yeah. And so permits, plans, these are hidden costs sometimes. Delays are costly. Yeah. I think that's something we missed in the course of running a business. Equipment depripation. I think when I started my business, I thought tools last forever. It's a brand new tool. Yes. But eventually that brand new DeWalt, whatever it is going to wear out. Yeah. Or sorry guys, you might be a Milwaukee guy. Yeah. But it's nonetheless, eventually you're going to be replacing the things, or they could fall off the ladder, or natural unnatural events. Right. Things happen and things break. Yeah. And so there's an aspect of that that sometimes gets missed, and callbacks. I mean, that's another piece. Who's paying for that? Customer's not paying for it. The punch list piece too, you mentioned. The punch list, yeah. It's a trap. It's a trap. Weather, distance. Do it right the first time. Yeah, right. Well, it's so hard to do. And Kinsey, we have this, people we talk to all the time that are struggling with this piece of performance, in the sense of doing things, not really factoring even the opportunity to do something wrong. And it's not that you need to factor like doing everything twice. It's more or less just having a margin to cover for things that happen.
Yeah.
Inevitably.
Yeah.
You need to be efficient.
Yeah.
But it's not always coming out of your pocket every mistake.
Totally.
And I think that's the consumer versus contractor mindset as well. As a consumer, we say, you make a mistake, you pay for it. And that's not how businesses work.
Right.
When you go to McDonald's and somebody gets an order wrong, as a consumer, you say, go make me a new burger, and I'm not paying for the second one. That's how it appears.
Everybody pays for it.
That's how it appears to the consumer.
Yeah, you're right.
I didn't pay for it.
Yeah, you're right.
However, that business did charge everyone else for that cost of this burger. It's just you need to keep the ratios within the margin. Yeah. So, it's not as though McDonald's lost money because they remade so many burgers.
Yeah.
They cut into their margins, of course, but they factor that.
Yeah.
There's a number.
That's good. That's a good call out. Okay, so we talked a lot about costs, right? Understanding your costs, you got to know your costs. But what about the competition? We haven't talked anything about the competition.
Don't worry about that.
Yeah, just ignore them.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think it's super common to look at what's the competition charging and trying to base, what your price is going to be off the competition. What would you say to that?
Yeah. Well, I think some of the mentality here is also we want to fit in, we want to be competitive, we want to stack up well against everyone else. This is human nature, right?
Yeah,
What's everyone else charging? A contractor had approached me about a new division he was thinking about opening his company. He basically wanted to install Windows. And I think we've mentioned this story on the podcast once before, but it's worth calling out again. And he said, one guy down the street was doing this for way less than he could possibly ever do it for, and he thought that was his competition. And then and I said, bro, go contact this other company that is essentially the dominant force in town. And he got quotes and he was shocked by what they were charging. Yeah. And so I said, I think competition, and I say that because it's so easy to think of competition in the wrong light.
Right.
Your competition might not be who you think it is. And also they might not be as relevant as you think they are. And this comes back to the value proposition kind of conversation. Yeah. Whereas if you're understanding your cost is a foundational piece for things, and then you understand your value, what you bring to the table, you're able to say, well, based on my knowledge and experience and performance and what I can bring to the table and delivering on a job, the profit margin's higher because you're delivering an experience that's exceptional. Yeah. Or if you're first starting out and you're still trying to get your legs underneath you and you're trying to figure out that process, well, the profit margins might be lighter. Yeah. But nonetheless, your overhead's not as high. And there's a value exchange going on. And we've talked about this in the podcast before.
And the goal is profitability, not just winning jobs.
Yes.
So you don't necessarily want to just position yourself as the cheapest guy to win more work, because we've talked about you got to make money. It's a business. It's, those kinds of things.
Let's just even think about that mentality. If you have the mentality as a contractor that I want to be the cheapest guy, what does that do as far as even what is it you bring to the table? It's just you're cheap. Is that what you want to be known for? Being cheap?
Yeah.
It's a funny thing about it is that's where we a lot of times find ourselves.
True.
I remember being this kind of moment where somebody had called me up about a project and said, hey, my number one goal is that it's cheap. That's what they communicated to me on the call. And there was a time when I'd be like, well, we'll be competitive. Yeah. Instead of being like, well, red flag. Yeah. I can't necessarily be the cheapest guy. Yeah. And do I want to even be the cheapest guy?
Well, and what does cheap even mean? Yeah, right? Like it depends on who you're talking to. Yeah. Right. I have my sister-in-law, she's in college. And she's been talking about living in a different place. And she was looking at plane tickets. And she was like, oh, I can't have any of my friends like come see me. And I'm like, oh, that doesn't seem too bad. Like, it's just a season of life thing. It's it's a where you're at. It's what class, is it, I don't know if class is the right term, but where are you at in terms of financial? Who are you trying to sell to? Who's your customer?
That's a great point.
And what type of work are you trying to win,
Yeah. Essentially, somebody that looks at a bid for something. I had this lesson where it was probably 15 years ago, and we had this job we were trying to win, and it was one of these jobs where it was very unique, something I'd never done before, and I was quite proud of all the effort I was putting into it, and there was all kinds of unique things about this job. It's the first $500,000+ job that we'd ever done before. Yeah. And I remember looking at all these costs and these line items and not understanding overhead like, I needed to. But nonetheless, coming up with a bid, presenting that to my customer. And the reason why we lost the bid.
It's too low.
It's too low.
Yeah.
They didn't believe us that we could do it.
Yeah.
And I thought, wow. fantastic customer. They gave us a $100 gift card, said thanks for bidding it out, and they chose somebody else. That
Wow,
was
that
twice
was
the
so
price.
nice.
Yeah, but no,
Yeah.
I thought that's a great strategy too.
Yeah.
As a consumer,
Yeah.
when somebody puts all the effort in, they saw we put a ton of
Thanks so
work
much.
into it,
Yeah.
and they just said, we saw that. Obviously, we weren't charging for bids at that point.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, I remember thinking, what? We can lose something because we're too cheap? Surprise,
It's
surprise.
true. It's
Because
true.
they wanted a quality job,
Yep.
and they recognized, fortunately for them, that they were smart enough to recognize
Yeah.
that costs money.
Yeah. Well, and the same bid, same quote could be presented to you and to me, and you might think it's cheap, and I might think it's ridiculous.
Isn't that amazing?
Super expensive.
Yeah, perspective does matter
Yeah.
here. And even having these conversations ahead of time with whoever you're trying to serve. One of my mentors, watching him sell, his number one tactic as a very experienced high-end builder is he would scare people with the price.
Wow.
He would go into the conversation saying, this is going to cost a lot of money.
Yep.
It's going to be drawn out. It's going to take a while. All of
Yep.
the negatives he draw out in the first
I'm
conversation.
gonna call it out, set expectations.
But the positive was, this is what we can deliver.
Yeah.
And if the positive was good enough to sell it,
then you got it.
and you got it.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, when those negatives were there, people would say, okay, well, no, never mind. That's not
Yeah.
what I want. And boy, he was out of there as fast as they wanted him out of there.
And he didn't waste any time though, right?
Didn't waste their time,
He
didn't
didn't
waste his
bid
time.
anything out. He didn't have to, that's pretty good.
Yeah.
Okay, so we talked a little bit about profit. What's a fair? What's a fair profit?
We have to go here.
Yeah, we do have
Yeah.
to talk about making money. We're talking
Yeah.
about covering our costs.
Right. Yeah. It's a funny thing because I think this comes back to the value proposition. We can talk about fair profit margins. I think there's minimums. If you don't make enough profit to actually run a business that can actually scale, reinvest, grow, and be something you can actually fall back on. So many people I know, Kinsey, it's just like they don't have viable business plans, even after years and years and years of operating a business where they're struggling to make ends meet. There's no savings. It's just paycheck to paycheck, job to job. That is not what you want.
Yeah, it's not the goal. It's not why you got in the first place either,
Right.
probably.
So let's say we understand our costs, hard costs. This is what it costs us for a specific job. We got it dialed in. We've added the padding. We've added the margin in order to allow for the mistakes to happen. We understand, okay, things aren't going to go perfectly. And that can be a 10, 20% margin sometimes on a job. And then you add saying, well, I need to make a 15% profit margin on there. Okay, that's where we arrive at. And then market conditions, how skilled you are, how efficient you are. These are all factors that contribute to how well you can execute on that job. If the margins are lower, you make more money in the sense of margins for error. If you're really precise and you're on that job and you're running like a boss, well, you're going to make more money.
Right.
But nonetheless, if you understand all of that, the fair profit margin really comes down to this kind of baseline of just being like, well, I need to make at least 5% profit on every job or it's just not worth being in business.
Seems low.
It does seem low. But I think where you make it up, though, is it's not that you are going to factor 5% profit. It's almost being like you need to make that profit, because it's the inefficiencies that really make up the difference.
Yeah.
Because you can want to make 15, 20% profit. Great, amazing. 30, 40% profit. But the problem with that mindset is somebody that's saying, I'm going to go in and make 50% on every job, nobody's going to pay 50% profit on every job.
Right.
And it's almost the illusion of 50% profit that's not even profit because you're using 45% of it to cover your overhead and mistakes.
Yeah.
So I've seen this happen so many times where somebody, I'm going to double my cost and that will be amazing money. And they're losing money.
Yeah.
Because they didn't factor overhead and didn't factor the inefficiencies and the errors and the inexperience that they might.
Yeah, you're going to get lucky every once in a while, and that'll kind of give you the false belief that
Isn't that amazing?
you know what you're doing and you've got your costs and you've got all that, but then you're going to lose it on
money.
a couple projects too.
Yeah. So does that really answer the question?
I think so. Yeah.
No.
Yeah. I think I was just looking at percentage, and I'm like, I think fair is.
It is subjective.
Subjective. Too.
Yeah,
we don't have a specific number. Yeah.
The reality of it is, though, is that most people are making low single digits as contractors.
Wow.
Several people I know that have huge value offerings are making 2, 3, 4% profit. And it's not that they should be making that. That's just what it ends up being at the end of the day.
Wow.
And so I think the word of caution in here is you need a goal. You need something you should strive for. You should go for 20% profit. You should go for 25% profit. But the reality of it is you will be limited by your ability to perform, to execute. That is way more important than budgets for profit. Because if you're having to redo everything, if you're having inefficiencies on ability to execute, we were talking back earlier about that, more or less that overhead piece in the sense of I have $30,000 of work that I can get done for that $10,000 ratio of overhead. Well, let's say we could get $50,000 of work done in that same period of time. The overhead's not relational to that necessarily.
Right.
You might need another truck. You might need, but it's sometimes there's an exponential gain you can have by efficiency.
Yeah.
And so I think that's where it's at from a profit standpoint. So if you're struggling, if you're saying I'm not making money, my profit margins are low, one of it's cost. Do I understand my cost? Do I understand my overhead? But also understand that sitting at home time or waiting for the next job or trying to get a punch list done or the inefficiency of not thinking through things through ahead of time. A lot of times that's where the lost profits at.
Yeah. It sounds to me like you got to be ruthless with your process of estimating so that you can really know your costs and continue honing in on your costs.
Yeah.
It's not just, hey, figure that once. It's, hey, after you've done the job, come back to that cost and actually rerun the numbers, right? Like improve your bids, improve your process, it'll save you money down the road. And then it's also being ruthless with your processes of managing projects and being able to fulfill. Yep. So simple, right?
Yeah.
Those two things.
That is the struggle, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, being able to, and I think
why construction's so hard.
It is so
right
hard.
There.
Yeah.
What do you say we're talking a lot about pricing and like, I'm obviously more of a consumer than a contractor in this seat, but what would you say to customers when they push back on price?
That's a good call out because inevitably people will be pushing
back. People will, yeah.
Yep.
They want a deal. They want to feel like they get it,
And some people have that mindset of they want to be able to negotiate. Can you do it for this price? The funny thing about it is I've had so many people. I remember this one time somebody walked into my office and said, and he was smart. I priced him out a job for $65,000. He walked into my office with a cashier's check pre-made out for $60,000. And he said, "Can you do it for $60,000?" And had a check on the table.
Wow.
And that's smart.
You said yes.
And we said yes. We weren't going to lose that.
Today,
cash today is better than nothing tomorrow.
True.
Cashier's check made out with your name on it for $60,000 is hard to say no to.
That's hard to say no to.
And so I think the piece about it though is you have to be also in these conversations. If you understand the cost. Totally. You can say no to things like that because you're going to say, no, that $5,000 is my profit margin. Yeah. I'd love to do it for you for $60,000, but I can't. Yeah. And you, instead of being able to say, like being wishy-washy about it, if you understand cost and you say, that's my profit margin, and you can explain that to your customer, being like that I need that.
Yeah, it's educating. Right. Your customer. You can educate
because
them
people get the idea because they look at the cost of materials. Like consumers that that are price conscious look at what things cost. Yeah. 2x4, and they're like, whoa, 100 2x4s and a few sheets of drywall and $10,000. It seems ridiculous. Yeah. And then you're like, well, they don't see the cost of running a business. Mm-hmm. And so that's educational. Instead of pushing back against that in the sense of making people look stupid or just feeling like they're trying to rip you off, help educate them in a very kind way. It'd be like, actually, my hard cost on this job, and not without being a schmuck about it. You know what I mean? There's people that sound so sleazy about this of just, my cost and I'm doing this for less than what it is. I mean, people can see through that.
For sure.
But nonetheless, if you really are honest about it and saying, I'm projecting my cost to be this, one of the freeing things I did, it should have been the first day in business, but it was like years later. We'll just ignore that earlier part.
Details,
yes. But what we had done was actually put the profit as a line item in the bid. And it was 12%. And it was a line, and nobody ever balked at it.
Wow.
And the reason behind it for me was, here's the things that I expect this job to cost me. Here's what I'm taking home. And when somebody looks at the number and says, well, they're not retiring off of me. That's a fair number. That's a profit. Like that's a normal profit. You put 50% profit on a job, people can say, whoa. That's why you need to understand your cost and overhead. And overhead is a cost when it's presented to the customer.
Yes.
It's not a separate line item. Yeah. Overhead is a part of hard costs when you present it to a customer. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, it's not like you're breaking out this into 3 line items. Right. It's 2. Right. It's my cost and my profit.
Yes.
And I wouldn't advise doing that probably early on when you don't understand your costs because you're going to need more margin. You're going to need to understand, you have to settle into what things cost you and what you brought up earlier about like reflecting back after a job and looking at the numbers. I mean, that needs to happen, so you don't want to kind of bury yourself into, people thinking you're making 12% when really making 2%, or you're losing money, or, that's a dangerous thing to be at too, because then people, think that they're paying you a fair value and you're feeling pressure like you're losing money. Right. So, I mean, that's a dangerous spot to be in too.
Yeah, that's good. I can imagine there'd be some fear too when it comes to like raising prices, right? We've had some customers and some people who had the same price forever. Yep. And I think there's a little bit of fear that comes with that. How did you overcome that? Or did you ever face that? Or what would you say to somebody who's like, man, I've been winning jobs for this, but I've been doing it for 10 years now. Like, you need to raise your price.
Right.
But what would you say to that person?
Well, I think you need to do it gradually as well, because your customer base is also acclimated to the fact that you weren't raising your prices. And so if you do that all in 1 month, people say, whoa, he's totally unaffordable. It seems like you went off the rails.
Yeah.
And so if you have a consistent customer base, this really depends on if you're working for the same people, you want to be gentle with them,
right,
and educate them of just like, we talked about on the last episode about this situation where the electrician had just, almost doubled his not his estimate, his actual invoice.
Right. Yeah.
Because he was so used to working with his builder, and now the price went way off the rails. And so the builder, whoa, what happened?
Yeah.
You don't want that moment.
Right.
And if there is that moment, you need to more or less have that conversation with whoever your customer is and said, I was doing some analysis and looking at my costs, and I'm losing money. And I want to be fair to you in this. So I want to let you know, we're raising our prices for these reasons. And so it's not just being like a willy-nilly, we had a tingle in our tail and we decided we want to raise our price. For sure. We want to make more profit. You just, you can educate them into that. Yeah. So there's the gentle aspect of it, being informative aspect of it. But then there's also, I think, an aspect of, a goal versus a pathway to get to a goal as well is sometimes important. Yeah. Like I remember meeting this painter, and he was telling me what his profit goals were for the year. And he was just starting out, and he said, I want to make $100,000 clear. Amazing goal. But none of the skills necessary to get it. And he's a great painter. Sure. But the character, the discipline, the show up to work and be efficient, like all of those things were missing. Yeah. And so I think we don't want to be delusional with our goals either. Yeah. If like, well, we'll raise our prices and we're going to make $250,000 this year. It's like, well, if you're only making $25,000 this year, I mean, I'm talking to myself, even in our current business, like we can make these ludicrous goals for ourselves. Like this year, we're going to just turn it over. It's going to be amazing, and it's like. Which
you have to have a little bit of that optimism a little bit of crazy. To get you out of bed in the morning,
That's true.
No, not get you out of bed, but like to keep you excited and like there's vision and it's exciting.
You do need that. But having a pathway is kind of all I'm saying.
A way to get there, not just made up pie in the sky.
Yeah, like it's all going to turn around on itself, on its own.
Totally.
You have to, kind of goals without a sort of reality check.
Without a pass, reality check your goals.
Yes. Are they practical? Yeah. I don't want to put the water on somebody's fire either. I just been there too many times to get to be cynical. Like, what a downer. Turn this podcast off. My goodness.
Oh, that's good. All right. What closing thoughts do you have?
Successful contractors don't guess their prices. It's not this, it'll be about this amount. Two things come out of that guesswork. Number one, you're wrong. And number two, your customer knows you're wrong. And so therefore, there's this pushback. It's tough to sell. If you know your hard costs, your indirect costs, you go in with confidence, you go with clarity when you're selling projects. You're able to say, this is the cost, and I'm charging a fair amount. You're immune to negotiation. This imposter syndrome. Like, am I charging a fair rate? You're ready to go. You're locked in. You know what things cost you. That's good. You know what your overhead is. You're confident. You're ready to go on this. And I think also you insulate yourself from losing money. And I think the other closing thought is this is simpler than we think it is. Yeah. It just takes some discipline. And it's a new habit. It's something you might not be doing now, but you have to do it. Yeah. You have to know what things cost you. And it's like you were saying earlier, Kenzie, you need to be able to have this after job review. Did we make money? Yeah. And even during the job review, what we ended up doing was biweekly. Yeah. Are we making money?
I would also say your customers will feel your confidence or your lack of confidence.
So true.
Too. Like, it's just a trait that humans have. Like, they'll sniff it out. If you don't know your costs, they'll feel that and they'll be like, this doesn't feel right. Doesn't feel like the right guy to go with. It doesn't feel like, but if you do and you're able to educate that and communicate that well, I think it'll be easier to win jobs.
So good. Don't forget your value, but use cost as the foundational piece for estimating. And it's so essential. And watch your business thrive. Watch your business grow. Yeah. It is such a freeing thing to know what things cost you. And so don't get stuck in this trap of like, well, it's so hard. You can't figure it out. So we just need to charge a lot of money. It's a dangerous trap.
It is, yeah.
And a lot of times you can't charge enough money. And if you know what things are going to cost you, and there's resources out there too. I know a big piece of what we're trying to do is helping people understand costs, helping people understand what things cost them and what they should cost as well.
That's right. All right. Guys, thanks for checking it out. We'll see you next time.
Keep up the good work.
See ya.